All right, welcome everyone. We're so glad that you are here this evening with us. I am delighted to introduce someone many of you may already know. Shannon Weston was a pastor in the Presbytery. I mean, still technically is a pastor in the Presbytery, but was the pastor at Ashland for over 10 years. Is that correct, Shannon?
That's right.
She is also a PCC, which is a certified executive coach through the ICF. She is a coach trainer and she is an expert on group dynamics. She is now also a senior process consultant with Design Group International. And it is my pleasure to welcome her here tonight to speak with us and lead a workshop on group dynamics and trust building. So Shannon, I'm going to give it to you to take away.
Thanks, Jennifer. That makes me sound so important. So, I'll take it.
You are so important.
I am so important. So we're going to talk a little bit tonight about group and team dynamics and trust building, specifically within our session. But this information can be taken to any committee work that you're on, any group that you're part of, really even to the congregation as a whole as you go through a process together. But for tonight's purpose, I'm going to limit that my uses of it to the session, because I think this is an area that is really important, that we almost take for granted as a session as we form our group. And I want to talk a little bit about patterns that develop and things like that it would be great for all leadership to be aware of. So the first thing I want to talk about is there's a story of an organizational person that he was working with the Navy SEALs. And he tells this story where he asked the Navy SEALs, how do you choose who goes on to SEAL Team 6? Like, how do you choose out of the best of the best here, who are the 6 that get chosen? And they drew him a little chart, right? And on one side was trust, and on the bottom was skill, right? So there are people with lots and lots of skill, and there are people with lots and lots of trust. And normally when we have a diagram like that, we're trying to hit that middle point, right? The person with the most trust and the most skill, right? And of course, that's the ideal person. All trust at 10, skill at 10. But what was interesting about the conversation is that they were saying that they would rather have a person with higher trust than the person with higher skill and lower trust. Mm-hmm. And that is key when we're talking about group dynamics and groups, right? And so we say that, and we use this word trust, and we say, that's wonderful, that's great. Of course we want to trust each other. We're the church. We trust each other. That's a given in our faith. And I can tell you that takes work and that takes time. So I start by telling that story to say, if you're ever a chair of nominating, or if you're ever part of the people that are picking the people to be on your leadership team, you really want to keep this idea of who you find trustworthy and who the church finds trustworthy in mind as you go through that process. Now, I also want to recognize that a lot of us are going through processes of nominating committees where we're just trying to fill a seat. And that can be the case. And some of the temptation is, well, we'll just stick a warm body in the seat, right? And so just keeping in mind as we do that really what's going to give us the most value out of this is somebody who does that, who has that trust already. And then there's the creation of the trust that happens with the group in the room. So another study that was read, not everything I do is scientific studies, but I just find these things fascinating because I'm a nerd. So another study that I read a long, long time ago, and so I'm not sure how applicable this is on Zoom, by the way, because this was a long time ago. So I want to name that. So for that trust to happen organically with a room full of people, you need 10 hours of face-to-face time. So I want you to imagine how long that takes for a session. So this is one of those math problems that my kids bring home that I don't actually know how to solve because the answer seems simple, but then when you get into the problem, it starts getting complicated. So I might say, wow, okay, so if it takes 10 hours of face-to-face time, then we have 2-hour session meetings. That's going to take 5 months. That's almost halfway through, but at least we're going to get there in 5 months. Well, there's a little asterisk that goes by that statistic, which it has to be the exact same 10 people there for 10 hours. And so if you're wanting this to happen organically at a session meeting, you may never get there, that the same 10 people show up for those first 10 hours. Because if you're missing one person or you add one person at your second meeting, you're starting over at 0. So in terms of the group dynamics, right? So all of that is to not discourage you, but it is to encourage things like an opening retreat, right? Where you spend 6 hours together and you knock out a lot of that time, or you're maybe learning together, growing together, having conversation together. There's also activities, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, of what we can do to build trust, right? So that 10 hours is not to be discouraging. That's just how it happens organically. So has anybody ever been on a mission trip, for instance, and you meet up at the airport and you're introduced to your group the first time? And can anybody observe that very first meeting? What happens during that meeting? Does anybody have any observations about what they've observed? No names. We'll give no names, but what kind of happens at that very first meeting? Anybody?
I think I can recall at least one in Cuba, first time ever. It was one of the strangest experiences of my life. You look around and you think, who are these people? Who's going to meet us? What do we have to do in order to get where we need to go? Who's in charge? It's just, it can be terrifying in a context like that. Now, maybe, a mission trip to someplace familiar, it wasn't that way after many trips, but yeah, I think it's intimidating, and it's, you feel very uncomfortable in some respects, no matter how gung-ho you are about the idea. Yeah, it's a little scary.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. How many of you have experienced a group forming at the very beginning and feeling a competition for who's in charge?
I will describe something that doesn't have to do with the church, but I was a travel agent for a long time, and we used to go on these trips where they'd show you the hotel toilets and all of this stuff. But anyway, when you get there, you look at each other and you size each other up. Let's see, is this person going to be a talker, or is this person going to be quiet? Is this person going to act like they're in charge and we don't want them to? So it's very much the same dynamic whenever you're with a group. That seems to happen.
That's right. That's right. So one of the mistakes that we make, in my opinion, as we go into a session as a leadership, is we make the mistake of going, oh, I know everybody here. Or, because we sit next to each other in church, in the same church, or because we belong to the same church, I know you. And so we don't need to do that work of, quote unquote, getting to know each other, right? Now, this varies by church size. If you're a particularly large church, you may walk into session and literally may never have met somebody who is on session. If you're at a smaller church, maybe you really do know each other and you've been serving together for a long time. But what we find that's interesting about group dynamics is that we need to, whether we know each other or not, put the effort into the beginning, leave space for the roles that we are taking on in that space. So I think about sessions as a triangle, right? So on one hand, we have the leadership that is the session. So, Joanne was a longtime parishioner of mine, right? So I knew Joanne sitting in the pew. I knew Joanne in certain roles. And then when she became a session member, though, she takes on a different role as a session member, right? So that's the kind of newness hat I want you to think about in terms of leadership in the session. And then on the other bottom of that triangle is the pastor. And we know our pastor from giving wonderful sermons and showing up at our hospital bed and leading in all of the leading Bible study. But the pastor has a very specific role in the session, which is to be the moderator. And so they may act differently than you've ever experienced them before. So that's the bottom of our triangle. And then the top of the triangle that gets formed is what we might call the third entity of the group, which is, we'll name the session as a whole. So it's all the leadership and the pastor, and the dynamics between them is the session. So it's an organism that is functioning different than the individual parts, right? And it's that organism is going to change each time 3 people are rotating off and 3 people are added. So that it's a new organization each time that happens. Everybody following me? Everybody good? Awesome. Any questions so far? I'm going to show you a chart that I just love. It's colorful. You're going to love it too. All right, I'm going to share my screen real quick. If my stuff would come up. That's interesting. You made me the co-host, right, Jennifer?
I did.
All right, let's just share my desktop. Okay, can you all see this sheet? Yep, okay, good.
Yes.
So this is Tuckman's stages of group development. I'm going to send this out to you as a handout afterwards, and I'll zoom in a little bit. But I first want to just start with our colorful thing at the top. So it started out with 4, and finally somebody added a 5th. So these are the stages of group development. So what we just discussed about mission trips or travel groups is the forming of the group, right? So the group first getting together, getting a feel for each other, that vying for leadership. And I want to just focus in a little bit on this one. So the forming stage is when we're identifying roles and what's expected to us and what the process looks like. We're maybe establishing some ground rules of how we're going to talk to each other, how we're going to function, and also what the boundaries are, what we have control over in this group, what we don't have control over in this group, right? And there's a general, in this area, a general polite tone, and there may be a little bit of anxiety or questions. Sometimes people want to get ahead because they want to know all the information. Sometimes people feel overwhelmed. So there's kind of this swirling of lots of things, but generally it's just we're staying at that polite, nice to meet you level. So what is required of leadership during this time? So what's required of leadership in that forming time is we're going to clearly communicate what our responsibility is and the structure of it and how it's going to work. We really, again, We don't want to assume that everyone knows each other or what they care about or why they joined session. So we really want to leave room for some getting to know you time, a retreat or some time at the beginning of the meeting, maybe a longer devotional that really gets to the heart of our call, why we're here. You didn't, you said yes beyond, well, I got, muscled into it kind of thing. And the leadership at this point wants to project a confidence and an optimism that like, I got you, I'm going to hold this container and I'm going to hold the hope for you. So quickly to move out of that is to move out of our comfort zone. We need to start risking ourselves a little bit, and we need to risk disagreement. All right. What's that number 2 one? This is where we start to get scared as a session. Is anybody acquainted with these stages of development? Have you used these before? So one of the reasons why I like to bring this into the conversation is because if you hear nothing else tonight, I want you to hear this. That storming or disagreements are good and healthy. It's actually a necessary step to moving us into productivity and into really a place of trust. So if you think about a relationship that you've been in, that you were friends with somebody or your partner, and then you went through something hard together, and you figured it out, you navigated that hard together, and then you came out on the other side, and you actually had the confidence and you were a little bit, quote unquote, better together on the other side. That's what we want to think about in this kind of storming stage. Now, I'm not talking about full-blown shouting matches in terms of conflict. That needs a whole nother bit of care that that some other expert can come in and talk through. But I'm talking about not being afraid to say, I disagree with that. I would like to think about this another way, right? That basic idea of disagreement. It's leaving room for different points of view and different personality styles. There's power struggles and clashes. And again, not all of those are bad. There's concern expressed for the excess work or, hey, we need to go back to that expectations because I'm really feeling like I'm being pushed beyond what's expected of me. And there can be, and we need to watch out for this, a vying for leadership. So active, some personalities can be active in trying to circumvent the pastor's leadership or a committee chair's leadership, something like that. So we want to be really aware that that's possible. Leadership, what's required of leadership? To acknowledge the conflict, to provide guidance, to teach resolution tactics, to invite shared models of leadership so that power doesn't get concentrated, and to offer support. And the way that you know that you're moving out of the storming stage is that you stop trying to test and prove each other, right? You try that, you stop doing that back and forth, and you move into a helping mentality and really listening. And so what do I mean by listening here? So if Jennifer says something that I disagree with, instead of saying, that is absolutely not right, why are we going over this again? I can't believe you're bringing this up again. I'm going to say, Jennifer, you've brought this up a few times. Can you help me to understand where you're coming from and why this is so important right now, right? So we're listening with this non-judgmental kind of curiosity. And that's going to help us navigate through this storming without creating more conflict. Something that's not on the sheet that I just want to name is that some people in that room are really conflict avoidant. And so we want to make sure that we're doing our inner work, right? That checking in with our bodies, checking in with ourselves of like, if I start to get paralyzed by disagreement, to kind of do that work to remind myself, this is good, this is healthy. I just need to listen. I need to ask questions. I need to clarify. but I don't necessarily have to react out of that anxiety. Does that make sense? So I want to take these next two together because they're really important. So there's norming and performing. And this is really where that the trust has come, right? Because there's a lot of balance in the room. There's room for everyone's voice in the room. Leadership is shared. When tasks are given and they're completed, there is celebration, right? When tasks are given and not completed, there is questioning and, hey, do you need help in that? Or, hey, why didn't that happen? There's accountability going back and forth in your room. This norming and performing is almost like two arrows that become a circle, right? You can flip back and forth between these two things. And I'll be honest, in the constraints given to us as a session, if you get to norming and you stay there, that's great. I honestly will say that. It is like you'll be moving forward, you'll be making decisions, you'll have productive conversations, and you will have found that trust. So when you read this, I don't want you to get too caught up in the idea that we have to perform at this super high level, especially these days when we are all exhausted, right? That really our goal is to get to this norming piece. So what is looked for in terms of leadership? Notice you will see shared leadership in both columns, right? So this is, I'm going to imagine a scenario with me where say we have a big enough church where we have separate committees, and the finance committee has gone through a budget and looked at a budget and handed it to us. And instead of going back through the line items one by one and redoing the work of the finance committee, we've trusted the people in the finance committee to have done their job. And we are here to look at it, ask a couple of questions, and but really not reevaluate their work. We're doing our job as a session, which is to say, is this the right budget for us? But we're not going back and doing their job, right? So another example is the Christian Ed Committee comes and says, we want to recommend changing curriculums. This one isn't working for our kids, et cetera, et cetera. And they come and they introduce that at session, and session says, no, we're going to stick with what we have. We disagree with you. We're not going to do that. Well, is there a lack of trust then? Or is there something going on? And really start to dig through the question in that of, are we going to throw this back to the Christian Ed Committee to do their work? Or do we need to ask ourselves in that session meeting, do we really not trust the committee that brought this to us? So that's the kind of thinking we want to do. Ideally, there would be trust in each of our systems that we as a session can really be visionary leaders and not have to do that nitty gritty work that our committees are doing, or rehash that. And then last, I just give a couple of things. These are some tasks that are done in norming. In norming, you're gonna hear a lot more like, hey, what do you guys think about this? You're gonna hear a lot more people asking for constructive feedback. And you're gonna hear some holding each other accountable, right? Well, I really appreciate, Rose, you volunteering, but you volunteered for 6 things already. And so I'm going to let, I hear you, but why don't we let somebody else volunteer for this one? I'm going to hold each other accountable that the whole group, right, that shared leadership is going on. And then in the performing, the continual learning, the trying new things, right? We're going to really get out of that comfort zone and try new things. We're also doing a lot of personal development, and we're getting really creative in our work. So that's when you've got that. When we get creative, we've got trust. That's one of the greatest, kind of ways of knowing that trust is there. And then last one, I promise we'll come back to the group, is adjourning. So this is what's interesting about sessions, is that the session, in very rare cases where a church has an administrative commission or is closing, do we actually adjourn a session? What usually happens is that a third rotates off and 3 more people come on. So there's a couple of things in this column that we want to honor even in the people rotating off. And then there's a couple of things I want to talk about that is different about sessions than a regular team that has an end point. So you can notice from people that are about to rotate off, there's some possible relief. They're tying up loose ends and handing off tasks. There may be a burst of energy at the end in order to get everything done before they go. We also want to make sure that we're doing a lot of listening and learning in that process. From leadership, we want a recognition, right? We want to recognize what those members have brought, the contribution they've made. We also want to hear from them, the lessons they've learned, and possibly even what their hopes are for this session that they're not going to be part of, in the immediate future, what their hopes are. I hope that this work continues. I hope that this happens. We want to provide opportunities for the individual acknowledgements and celebration. And I give that because I do think that's really important, that people are celebrated in the time and the effort that they gave, that they're freely given, right? Giving in their work on session. The task in adjourning is having clear handoffs and clear handoffs of projects. So we're gonna, like I said, I'm gonna send this to you. You can also Google Tuxman's stages of group development, and there is lots of information out there for you on it. But I wanted to give you an overview and talk through it specifically for sessions. So let's talk a little bit about that. For those of you that came in a little bit late, I just wanted to give my recap quickly, is that this is being recorded for other elders to watch at a later time. And so we're going to talk general questions together, but at the very end, we're going to turn off the recording if you have specific questions that you want to ask that maybe you don't want recorded, about a specific session or group, that you're part of. So let's pause there and ask for some questions. I know I just threw a lot of information at you. Yes, ma'am, Melanie.
All right, so I've unmuted. My question is about, you were talking about leadership in the group. There are times when the pastor actually becomes the leader of the session. Now, I don't know if that happens all the time, or that was my experience, that our pastor was leader of our session. So there's like no question of who's going to be the leader, right? Or do you think that there are people who would challenge that question of leadership?
So in our system, the moderator of session is the pastor.
Right.
And so one of the things that you can notice in this column is that some of those things on there are things you can expect from your pastor as moderator during this time. Maybe there's opportunity, if it's not going well, that you want to have conversation and share information with them. But I also want to lift up that this leadership line is that you are in a shared leadership model. Even though the pastor is moderating, you are all modeling good leadership at that meeting, right? Mm-hmm. So you can participate in all of this as you go through the meeting, even though you're not actually moderating or quote unquote leading, right? You're not the one going through the agenda, but you're able to model these leadership skills and what is required in each stage during the meeting.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, Suzanne.
So could you clarify, when you talk about the pastor as moderator, could you clarify what moderator means in this context, especially as opposed to leader?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so can you compare and contrast those two roles?
So my role as a moderator is to facilitate the meeting. So I'm going to make sure we're following the agenda, whether I as the pastor did the agenda or whether the clerk did the agenda, that we're following the agenda. Some moderators, depending on personality and church, follow Robert's Rules of Order very, clearly. I have, in the church that I was last serving, we built to a place of consensus building. And so there would be times for formal vote, but we really did a lot of our work by consensus. And that was because we had gotten to a point where we stayed in that kind of circle of norming and performing. And then as people exited and entered, it was, rocky at times, but we didn't quite go all the way back to the beginning. So, we did a little bit of information and group building and all of that, but they entered a system, which was in that norming and performing cycle. So the moderator's role is a little bit different, but the PCUSA answer is they're the facilitator. They're there to make sure that Robert's Rules of Order and our Constitution is followed. But as a person who really very much cares about leadership skills, they're also there to perform these tasks under the leadership skills of each one of these to kind of keep the process moving forward, make sure our voices are heard, make sure somebody's not bullying other people. That's all what's going on as the moderator. And in my role, to make sure that my opinion wasn't being, lifted up too much, quite honestly. There were times that I gave my opinion and there were times that I was quiet, and to really keep the group doing their work. Because ultimately, right, it's your work and your church. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. If we have more specific questions, we can get to those in the end. What other questions about this might you have? Or Jennifer, I'll offer any observations you have that you'd like to share.
I don't think I have any right now. I'm loving the presentation, and I'm loving the questions too, which I think are really helpful. Yeah.
So I would be curious if if you walked into the beginning of a session, right, or like where you were all gathering together for the first time, even if some people are new and some people aren't, and the idea of disagreement and conflict was normalized in the very beginning, right? Hey, this is going to happen, and this is how we're going to handle it when it does. How do you think that would change the dynamics of the sessions you've been on? Yes, Rose. Oh, you're muted. Oh, Rose, you're muted, hon. If you can put it in the chat or wait a second and we'll come back to you, because I'd love to hear your question or your comment.
There we go.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Now I forgot what I was going to say.
Unmuting
that
is half
sounds
the
easy.
battle.
Yeah, it sounds like it's easier said than done. This is the conflict that's going to come up, and this is how we're going to deal with it. It sounds like a very positive thing, but can you get there just by laying out a process?
I'm so glad you asked. This brings me to my second handout that you're going to get. So here we go. Here we go. All right. Do you see this now?
Mhm.
Starts with a dove. Okay. So the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program, this was adopted by the General Assembly 20 something years ago, and is now part of the Matthew 25 adoption. So this is a document that I have given to every session I've ever been a part of. And this is the way that I used to start that conversation of saying, this is going to happen, this is going to come up, and we have this beautiful document on how we're going to handle this when conflict or disagreement comes up. And again, I want to be careful. I'm using those interchangeably. Disagreeing is one thing, full-blown conflict is another, and we can, reach out and talk about that differently and later. So we have beautiful guidance of scripture that helps us do this well. We're going to listen right before we give an answer. What is really being said? Can I ask questions? We're going to make sure that, we're saying we're going to treat each other respectfully. What does that look like? And talk about that in the room, right? What does that look like for us? What do I need when someone disagrees with me? How can I hear that? How can I hear that well? Doing that kind of work. State what we think we heard, right? This is a good technique, So what I just heard and what you said was this. Is that right? Because I'm really confused as to how, paying for the new mulch in the playground has to do with the Christian ed curriculum. So can you help me understand, what your connection was there before I jump to conclusion and say, oh my, like this person's an idiot. What are they thinking? That kind of deal. Speaking the truth in love, right? This is not I'm going to abuse you and then say I'm doing it for your own good, right? Speaking the truth in love is sharing concerns, empathizing, being respectful of each other. We're going to focus on ideas and suggestions and not make assumptions about people's motives, or that you're a bad person or, for having that idea. Well, maybe that's not a great idea for us right now. Doing that kind of thing, sharing personal experiences when we disagree, not for manipulation purposes, right? But so to bring, hey, here's why I get so emotional when we talk about this, and again, if you have that trust, it's a little easier to share that. And then maintain the unity of the spirit in the bond of peace, right? From my favorite scripture passage. So we want to hear from other viewpoints. This is one of those, we believe we are better together, so even if I disagree, but I'll tell you a story from my first church. We were talking about adding a half-day classroom to the not the Sunday school, the childcare preschool. Thank you.
Nursery school, yeah.
Yeah, words are not, it's very late, guys. So, and
Understand.
There was one person on this session, God love her, and she just said, I don't see it. I don't think people will come. I don't think there's a need for this. I don't see it, but you all do. And so even though I don't agree, and I thought it was just one of the most beautiful moments, to be able to say that, right? She maintained that unity in that spirit to be able to say, I'm going to admit it. I don't see it. I don't understand, but you all do. And so I'm not going to do this blindly, but I'm also not going to go 6 months from now when it didn't work, I told you so. Right. Now 6 months from then, she came back and she was like, I can't believe it. You all were right. It was so successful. This was so great. I'm so glad I was proven wrong, you know? So we kind of want to take that spirit into our disagreements, right? Is that, hey, maybe I'm not right, but maybe I am. So I'm going to articulate my point. I'm going to get it across. But if it's not what's voted on, it's not what's voted on. And I'm going to support my peers, you know, in that. So there's the top sheet, which is really what I handed out. What I'm going to give you there's kind of a question and answer study that comes along with it. You're welcome to dig into that some more, but I really find that top sheet is really what's very helpful to give to people. Yep. And so that's just one way, but then we have a resource, right? We have something tangible that we can go to and say, you know, I'm feeling really uncomfortable at the direction of this conversation. Can we all just take a minute and breathe and turn to our resource on this, read it through for a minute, and come back to this discussion with, you know, with a spirit, you know, of peace and unity. Unity isn't unified, right? Unity doesn't mean we all have to agree and we all have to, you know, whatever. It just means that we're holding each other with that care and that love. And also saying the hard thing, like, we're just not going to spend $100,000 on that, you know. You know, really voicing a dissenting opinion is okay. Yes, David. Oh, there we go.
I think it's important. Can you hear me now? Sorry about that.
Yep.
I think it's important to remind people that they're part of session not because of what they believe. It's what they believe is best for their church community. And through the conversations, the good and the bad and the difficult and the challenging ones, how do we as organizational leaders create a sense of belonging, a commitment to the church community, and remind people that that's why we're here. We're here for the benefit of the church community. I know we've been doing a lot of work at our church around belonging and community, diversity, disability, spirituality. And to me, it's all a big theme of we're not always going to all agree, but what's our community needs and not what my personal needs are. And that's hard to let go of. We have, you know, when you build your session, you want people who are strong, a sense of of understanding and belief. And yet sometimes people forget it's not about me, it's about us.
Yeah, thanks, David. There's lots of beautiful ways to do that. One, you know, you have the ability, if there's been a particularly hard moment, you have the ability to ask for a breath or ask for a prayer. You know, before we vote, can we just take a moment and pray for guidance from the Spirit of, you know, what is best for our church and our community at this time? And just kind of using that language, you know, on a regular basis to keep that being the focus. Maybe there's something you as a session, you know, I've seen sessions actually make a covenant together, you know, in the beginning, and that's put on the wall in the session meeting to say, you know, we will put the needs of our whole over the needs of our individual, you know, and we will follow the Spirit's guidance, even if it's different from, you know, what we walked in here thinking we thought about it, you know, that kind of thing. And again, doing that work separately, right? You can take that work out into the congregation by having really open communication about what's going on at session, doing town hall meetings that don't require a quorum and a whatever, but hey, if you want to hear what we've been talking about and what we've been doing, come on out to the town hall after church and we're going to catch you up on what session has been doing. So that transparency as well. But particularly the last thing I want to say about that and the belonging piece is that when people are heard and listened to and asked questions about their point of view, they really feel valued. And when we feel valued as an individual, not only does that trust factor go up, but we're gonna, as a group, really be able to shift our personal point of view a little bit quicker because I've been heard and I feel that I was understood. It's just we're going in a different direction. It's not personal, right? So I was valued in the process, even though it's not going quote unquote my way. So that's that belonging piece that I really think is very important. Any other questions? And we'll cut off the thing and then we can talk specifics. Or not, maybe you've got everything else. All right. So I will send these out. Jen will put them on. Oh, yep. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Evie.
Shannon, I just wanted to say thank you for the reminder that the chemistry can change from month to month. I notice, especially when we have two men who are, I say from the financial end, educated and they know what they're doing and they bring their reports. But if one is not there, they don't have the bounce off that we benefit from. And that was just the clearest example I could think of. But thank you for that reminder, because everyone brings something special to the table. It's just sometimes someone else brings out our better, and vice versa. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, and what I appreciate about you lifting that up is if we're noticing that we're disagreeing more when one person is there and versus a month that they're not there, that doesn't mean that they're wrong or need to rotate off necessarily. It may be that they're the agitator that we need to actually build consensus and move ourselves forward, right? So we may have all checked off. I'll just give this example quickly. And Joanne, this may sound familiar. We were doing a building renovation and the committee had met and we'd gone through all of these, estimates and chose which one to do. And they presented it and they said, here it is. And, a couple of people on session were like, well, maybe that's not, can we really afford to do all this? Can we really, and admittedly, the 4 members or so on the building team were getting really frustrated. Like, well, we just did all this work and why don't you come do all this work and blah, 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 right? Rather than actually, like, I really had a good moment of perspective to be able to say, you know what, I'm glad they didn't just check mark this. I mean, we're talking about $100,000. We should ask some questions about it. And we should be able, the building committee people should be able to answer them, which they could and they did. And ultimately it was voted yes. So I lift up that example to say, sometimes we think, oh, like we were done. What are you doing? Right? When, really it led us to the other side, that when we presented it to the congregation, we had answers that we wouldn't necessarily have had before because we had already had the questions in our session meeting. Thank you for that. It's all about perspective, right?
I have a point or a question.
Yeah, Cecil.
I'm the moderator for the Presbytery of Baltimore. And
Yes, you are, sir.
I am. And today I had lunch with the vice moderator and previous moderator. And one of the point of our getting together and having lunch was because we want to clearly define the positions of moderator and vice moderator. And we're thinking, let's take a look at what rules were established that said you will serve 1 year in each of 3 different years in different capacities. Maybe it should be some other length and term for those persons that are going to be future moderators. And I look back at the experience that I had and still have on the session of my church. I've been fortunate enough to be a member of a session where the pastors were strong enough characters that I can't think of any time that we had disagreements that became uncomfortable. And probably the most contrarian of all of the sessions I've been on, the most contrarian person was me.
And that's why they didn't feel uncomfortable to you.
And people tolerated it. I don't know why they put up with it, but it never amounted to anything more than a disagreement.
Yep.
And so some serious issues that had to do with the continuing survival of our church. We had ways to stop the financial bleeding, decisions that really important that had to be made. And if I didn't agree with some of the decisions that were being made, that's as far as it went. There was no animosity. There was no retribution. It was, okay, this is what happens. This is life.
Yeah, so that's what I was kind of describing of like when this work is really done in sessions to normalize your forming, when you kind of put your forming and even your storming into the process. It's not that storming doesn't happen in those norming and performing categories. It's that you know how to handle it, right? And that's what you're describing, is that people felt free to disagree, right? That was okay. So it didn't cause tension. It was what I would argue is there was enough trust in that room that I'm not worried about disagreeing with you because I know that you'll respect me in the end. And I know that I might not quote unquote get my way, but I'm free to give this because I trust these people and they seem to trust me too. So that's a beautiful example of that norming and performing cycle. Melanie.
I wanted to know if we were still on tape or we.
Why don't we stop recording? So thanks to everybody that's watching this later.